Also ich habe gar nicht so eine tiefe Stimme, finde ich.
I don't think my voice is that deep.
Katja, meine Frau,
Katja, my wife, was up until last week of the opinion that I was gonna be talking about home automation today. So this proved to me that she didn't read my blog post that was up for the last 3 months. And because the question came up somewhere else, I'm not going to talk about home automation, but rather about something else. And so in the description for this talk that probably nobody read, I claim that we probably don't know what we want. Well, maybe in the moment, you know, a nicer apartment, pizza, dancing, get outside. But what do we expect? What do we want out of life? Success, happiness, yeah, most everyone. Some countries even have that in their constitution. But of course, there's a caveat to that, because Americans have to take care of their happiness on their own. And so how do we get to happiness? Nobody really knows. And 30 years ago, I found the question that was unanswerable and led to loads and loads of sorrow. And 20 years ago, I put it up on my homepage. And so back then, this seemed to me very passive-aggressive. You know, nobody answered it. So the question was, what do you want anyway? And so Mark Zuckerberg was smarter about this question. He asked people about what they just did and about what they thought. And so he probably got a couple of quadrillions of answers. But us mere mortals, we aren't equipped to ask these questions. And Douglas Adams made fun of this a couple of years back already when he talked about deep thought, a supercomputer that had to calculate for a couple of million years the answer to life, the universe, and all the rest, and the answer was 42. So the question isn't very much important, more important than the answer. And last year I read a quote that the meaning of art is to uncover the questions that are being made invisible by the answers. And so 42. A couple of weeks back, I found out that I had to, you know, write a speech that had to make some sort of sense, and I didn't have much time left. And so why not talk about home automation still? And during this heated preparation period, these things arrived at my house. Those are smell sensors from China, and I wanted to build their weight sensors. And so I wanted to measure how long I stayed in bed for. And so I called this the Jens Spahn latte, which is a wordplay, a joke on part of a German politician. And so these are wired this way to a microcontroller built into my bed. And look and see, I could see that at 4 in the morning, you know, I got up probably to think about this talk. Before I got into searching for more information, I searched about an online award. I wanted to see what was going well and not so well within German media. And then I clicked around here, and you know, there's this guy I know, but there's so many interesting pages here that I don't know. And then this one was, you know, that seems cool. Nice picture. Journalism school. Young journalists go to a small village in the German countryside for 2 weeks and made a documentation about the life of its inhabitants. Very nice. Used a drone, scrolling, read a bit. And then, you know, they always tell you when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you're trying to prepare a talk, you know, you also find lots of stuff. And then I found this quote: who's young is looking for his place in the world. Who's young asks himself, who am I? Who do I want to be? And where do I belong? And growing up means making a decision. Last year I quoted Erich Fromm, living structures can only be by changing, can only exist by adapting. So this is the process of life. And so, I'm just going to quote more intellectuals here. And yeah, so it's not only about young people trying to grow up, also other people are lacking in that way. And so these questions we should always ask ourselves for our whole lives. Who am I? Who do I want to be? Where do I want to go? And so it's all about storytelling, right? So we've been telling stories for thousands of years. And now, today we have like TV movies and stuff, but back then it was tales, fairy tales. And so for a couple of years, people thought in the 19th century that the European fairy tales had some sort of Indian heritage. So this Theodore Benfey put up this theory, but Wikipedia says, people don't believe that anymore today. And it seems like common motives in popular fairy tales are being found all over the world. And the scholar of Sigmund Freud, C.G. Jung, tried to explain this by coining the term of psychological archetypes and the collective subconscious. And so we've been telling the same stories for thousands of years. We have symbols in our dreams that maybe even people back in the Stone Age already dreamt of. And we don't really understand this, but we can experience them in dreams, psychoses, and fairy tales. And the theory of archetypes, according to Wikipedia, is still valid. Archetypes are being used in loads of different scientific theories where they have different names. These psychological structures, neuronal structures, and one of those motives is the archetype of the female heroine.
Heroes have to fight against insurmountable powers or beyond human opponents and are often superhuman themselves. Currently, these heroes are having quite the moment, and I suspect that if Hollywood continues like this, the archetype of the hero will soon be oversaturated. Again, heroic figures in fairy tales and myths can be interpreted psychologically as inner processes, stories in which figures of heroes have to prove themselves in their fights can be regarded as internal fight against the dark aspects of their personalities. Trees are also archetypes. One fairly known tree is the tree of insight, in like the world of living trees that come out about the Western religion stories. And the Maya also had a tree as a motif in their mythologies, and in China one talks about trees with fruit of mortality. On the note of trees, only last year I realized trees are basically air. Everyone should know that who paid attention in biology class, because wood is mainly generated from the carbon dioxide from air. Trees are made from air. 2/3 are made from air. With the help of solar energy, trees lignify air. But, so yeah, fairy tales are also kind of tales of self-discovery, or as psychologists like to say, they can be read as way to autonomy. Maybe that's why most stories we tell or are told or we stream or we watch in the theater or we read actually deal with self-discovery. As in fairy tales, most films don't only talk about how a hero or heroine overcome obstacles, but also always much more explicitly than fairy tales, how these character's personality grows, more human, more mature, more grown up throughout the course of the film. Most films and TV shows are often about the question, what is human, what makes us human, what are the dark sides that we have to overcome. This is the first strong thesis that I'm putting up. Popular culture is all about masturbation. So basically these stories, these mirrored stories, you have to take them with a grain of salt, because the authors who of these books of storytelling, they know these mechanisms. They use it as a kind of box and tool system, and I mean, after a couple of research, I couldn't find out what homeopathic archetypes are, but Christopher Booker claims that there's only 7 patterns of narration that all stories told in the world are based upon, and this is not completely undisputed, but it demonstrably works. And that's why marketing people are super thankful to him, because they can use archetype stories to write a company's story. Consultants are happy because they can sell their storytelling workshops and guarantee of success with over 1,000 years of experience. But even www.strategicstorytelling.de in this marketing mumbo-jumbo realizes that all stories of humankind sort of trace back to these plots. More so, these plots can be traced back to one fundamental idea, that of the psychological development of the human. All characters are only fragments of the I. When we read novels, when we go to the movies or a play, we experience glistening variants of our own soul lives. I think that's kind of great. So you can kind of turn this into a joke. An alien comes into joke, down to earth, and asks, so what is it that you do in your spare time? What are you particularly interested in? The human responds, the psychological development of the human. It's the first time that I think I've used Comic Sans as a font. The problem with these modern stories that film and TV and often also literature are telling is, however, that they never leave unanswered questions. Just the way humans like these archetype stories, they despise too much ambiguity and open questions, kind of the way that my talk is going to end. Modern stories usually drown us in answers, and they're not open to interpretation, and if they are, they're mostly trivial. Fairy tales, however, are often open to interpretation. There's little that hasn't been interpreted into them. That's about as open as they are. And the special thing about fairy tales is their symbolic language. And their symbolic language is also kind of a problem because we don't really understand this language quite well. Erich Fromm explained the symbolic language, or the characteristic of the symbolic language, as follows. We sort of don't have problems explaining the functionality of machines, while I do fear that most of you don't really understand the functionality of the measuring stick I presented to you earlier. But it becomes complicated for us when we try to explain emotions or different flavors of red and white wine. When it comes to wine, we usually just go like, oh, just you try. Explaining your feelings to someone else, that's maybe less difficult than describing the taste of wine, but it's usually quite exhausting and comes with a lot of words. In a dream, you can rely on one singular image, and you only need like a second to realize the situation. And nonetheless, this image seems to be more accurate and alive than the description of the feeling, than what we can give someone trying to explain to them what we feel. The image perceived in the dream is a symbol of what we feel, is what my therapist says. I'm going to attempt to interpret 2 fairy tales to make this more clear. But the first one actually isn't a fairy tale, but according to Fromm, it's written in symbolic language. So in my interpretation, I rely on his analysis from fairy tales and myths, where he analyzes Franz Kafka's The Trial. The book is quite Kafkaesque, and it's about, in all short summary, about a bank employee, Joseph K., that is taken into custody and then let go shortly after. But there's a trial going on against him, and K has no idea what he's being accused of, and he never really gets to see the judge. In the final chapter, he's then being executed, and that is how the chapter, like the book itself, starts. Someone must have slandered Joseph K., because without him having done evil, he would not have been arrested one morning. And Fromm in this context interprets that arrested actually in this context means to be stopped in motion. Like symbolically, this means that K was feeling that his development is being stopped and blocked. And Fromm thought this paragraph was such genius, that is why I will read it in total. In this spring, K tended in the evenings to spend his evenings after work, where he would sit usually until 9. He would go for a small walk or meet up with someone familiar, and he would have a drink where he would meet up with old, strange, regular men, and he would usually spend their time there until 11. There was also exceptions, though, to these. If Kay, for example, would be invited, would have to be invited by his boss, who would invite him to a car ride or to a dinner to his villa. And sometimes Kay, once a week, would meet up with a girl named Elsa, who by the night, in the late morning, would work as a bartender at the where he would drink. So Fromm interprets this as Kay's obviously his life is filled with emptiness and full of routine and sterility, and he's actually stuck and is not warns him. He's not realizing that the problem is found to be within him, and that only he himself can save himself. And the trial does not have a happy ending because the hero himself doesn't really dare to take the departure. He doesn't help himself. He's seeking for help. He's asking for questions, but he's seeking for answers, but he's never asking the right questions. In the end, when Kay is executed, he starts realizing how greedy and empty he is, and in the light of death, he realizes this possibility of friendship and human solidarity, but that's much too late. So the counterpart to Joseph Kay is Hans G., or rather Hans and Luck. Last week, I talked to my co-worker Melle, that currently has the ungrateful task to simultaneously translate this, what Hans and Luck English title could be. We came up with Lucky John, which somehow sounds rather pornographic. Google informed us that it's actually Hans and Luck. Hans and Luck actually is not a classic fairy tale either. It's more of a Joel story. It was published by August Weinecke and then shortly after added to the Brother Grimm's collection of tales. Hans had served his lord for 7 years when he spoke to him. Lord, my time is up. Now I want to go back home to my mom. Please give me what you owe. And the master responded, you always served me loyally and truthfully. The way you served should now be your pay. He handed him a piece of gold bigger than the size of his head. And the chunk of gold soon becomes too heavy for Hans, and he exchanges it for his horse. And, well, Hans said, well, the horse riding is such a beautiful thing. One sits on a chair unbothered by any rocks on the ground, and I mean the horse kind of kicks him off, so then he trades the horse for a cow, and then the cow for a pig, and the pig for a goose, and then the goose against 2 sharpening rocks.
And each time they trade, Hans and Luck is very happy, and at the end when the stones drop in the well, he shouts, there's no one under the sun as happy as me, and I'm free of all cares. And then he jumped forth until he arrived back at his mother's home. And the obvious interpretation of the story is that Hans is an idiot. Even worse, he doesn't follow his destiny. He doesn't fight the problems in his way. He doesn't even try to ride a horse. Instead of development, there's stagnation. Instead of growing up, he becomes more infantile. And I don't like this interpretation. Instead, I see Hans as somebody being autonomous. He doesn't care about social structures that predetermine value. He found the easiest way to be happy. And by putting off his cares, he finds happiness. And going back to his mother can also be seen as going back to life. And so he's obviously not dumb, otherwise his master wouldn't have paid him for his services. And so if we take this interpretation one step further, we might also say that he's very generous, just as the motto from Cologne. You also have to give. And so this might be Hans, who's sort of smiling because of us, because we're trying to achieve all these goals, because we're trying to fit into all these structures, giving to us by society instead of following our own goals. And so obviously there's parallels here to Buddhism. In Buddhism, there's a similar tale of the shepherd and the ox. And here's the shepherd who's sort of gone lost and lost his oxen. And he finds a trail, follows it, and finds the oxen and tries to tame it. And this he achieves. And then so he looks after the ox, and they become friends. They get used to one another, and the ox even seems to forget about the grass growing on the side of the road. And so it's not finished yet, but I'm going to start with the interpretation anyway. Heinrich Müller, a Catholic student of theology, and he said that the ox was a stand-in for the deep self, and the person was the human itself. And so this was supposed to be some Zen exercise. And so here they've already achieved freedom. And then the shepherd doesn't need the ox anymore even. And so he's alone, and then at the end they both disappear into a comprehensive nothingness. And then at the end, this is what it looks like. At the end, all things are just the way they are, and this is supposed to be the everyday life of the enlightened human being. And here we see the shepherd going to the market, and what he says is the enlightened lives with all his fellow human beings just as his human beings, but the goodness that surrounds him, his aura of goodness, comes from his enlightenment. And again, I want to talk about autonomy. This is very pragmatic and can be, taught. And we're obsessed with autonomy. There's autonomous vehicles, autonomous bread even. So in popular culture, we have some very intelligent discourse on autonomy. Frankenstein's monster, Blade Runner, replicants, and so forth. But concerning our own development towards autonomy, that's pretty hard for us. And the reason is simple, because it's really hard for us. It's really hard for us to fight against our darker sides. It's hard to believe in the good in ourselves, the good in other people, and to free ourselves of societal pressures. In March, there was an article in edition F by an anonymous writer. She can't stand Berlin anymore. You're always trying to catch up. You're always running around. Berlin is some sort of fight for me. And then Lorenz Maroth wrote, yeah, it's all really terrible, but maybe Alva, the autonomous writer, should think about what she's looking for and her wish for conformity. And I laughed at this remark. Very dry humor, but we all might ask, don't we carry this wish for conformity within ourselves and maybe give it too much space? And this conformity, this really, gets too much attention. And when I talk about the media, I also mean all of us, because, with likes, shares, and whatnot, we all distort our realities. And our perception is always distorted, by different factors. I tried to prove this here 3 years ago. Kann tried to prove it 200 years ago. And Patrice tried it 2 weeks ago. She wrote, this love your body, all people are beautiful calls are sort of strange to me. Why does everybody have to be beautiful? When you always call people to love their own body and to say that all people are beautiful, then of course that's some sort of beauty paradigm itself. So it doesn't seem to be possible to not be beautiful. Everyone is beautiful, in a diverse way, but for me that's something else. I tend to feel some sort of equality, some sort of not caring. And so Patricia is talking about shifting perception. The category of beauty is a social construct that we can shift if we want to. And the ability to not care, of course, that also comes with age. But I do think it's something we should strive towards. And against this is Hans. Hans Rosling, he also fights against prejudice, and he tries to convince us to not think that the world is becoming worse and worse. And so he wrote this book and said that the world is actually much, much better than we tend to think it is. And so Christian Stöcker wrote in his very good column on Spiegel Online about this, and Rosling himself, he had the audience participate, and this is an example. He asked, how many did the number of deaths by catastrophes increase or decrease? And half of Sweden believes it increased. Yet, in fact, it's more than half in comparison to the 1900s. But only 12% of Swedes realize that. And so in his tech talk, he went to the zoo and asked chimpanzees. And the chimpanzees actually managed much better, and even better than the audience at the TED Talk. And so, you might ask yourself, well, did he really go to the zoo? Or, this seems to be a regular statistic, but this is a really great joke. And of course, the monkey example shows that prejudice and intuition can be a disadvantage. And so the problem we have here is cognitive dissonance. If there's terrible stuff happening in the world all the time, how can it be that at the same time everything is somehow getting better? We have a distorted image of the past, and we don't have the tools to measure an objective, comprehensive image of the world. And so that's why we often fail, and fail hard. So, for example, when we take a flight to somewhere, we're really angry when we have to wait in the security line for 30 minutes. We have to give up a water bottle. We don't even think about it. Our grandparents or great-grandparents, it would have been much more costly and much more time-intensive to do the same sort of traveling. But in earlier times, you had all these dangers that you had to face. And so if we lack the ability to recognize the privileges we have today in comparison to previous generations, if we're unable to think in comprehensive images, can we just, learn a little bit from Hans and Luck? Can we just be happy that we can be safe and we can fly fast into every corner of the earth? And it's not just about traveling or, technological progress. It's also about a day-to-day life where we lose the historical context. Our food is so safe. Food has never been safer than today. 100 years ago, it was much more possible to get food poisoning and die. And of course, air pollution, that's still a huge problem. But still, this is because we can measure the amount of air pollution so detailed today. In the Ruhr area in Germany, particle pollution has decreased by a factor of 10 over the last 100 years. And so we always point to irrational fears of people who are afraid of immigration, afraid of Muslim immigrants turning this country into chaos. And and which is full of these irrational fears and false beliefs.
Aber uns fehlt eben ebenso die Fähigkeit, die Welt unverzerrt.
Hans and Lek might be lacking something every other intellectual has, but just like we're lacking the view the world undistorted by our own sensitivities, by fear, by complexity. In light of this, it almost sounds arrogant to be laughing at Hans. At least he is happy and satisfied. Well, we're eaten up by ignorance, anger, and stress levels, or our conscience is putting us on trial. Maybe we should gaze upon Hans a bit more kind. On Wednesday, Sasha said against right populism, it's not just enough to be against, it also needs a what for. This means we need to find a way in this world, but within ourselves as well. It is how important it is to find this way. This cat picture by Lewis Carroll shows if it doesn't matter where we're going, then it doesn't matter which path you take. Just so you remember, Hans knew where he wanted to go.